May 26, 1989. A young woman vanishes from Arlington, Virginia, as if the earth itself has swallowed her whole. 2 years later, a set of human remains is discovered on the shoulder of Interstate 95, one of the busiest highways on the East Coast. Cars rush past every day, but the woman lying in the dirt has no name, no story, no justice. She becomes a Jane Doe, her identity erased, her voice silenced. For nearly 3 decades, she remains a mystery, an empty file, a cold case gathering dust. It would take another disappearance, another woman, and the shocking confession of a killer to finally bring her name back. Only then would the world learn she was Marta Haydee Rodriguez, a 26-year-old whose life had been stolen long before her body was ever found. This is the story of how a missing person became a nameless ghost, how a roadside grave kept its secret for decades, and how one man's dark pattern of violence finally began to unravel. And it all begins in Arlington, Virginia, in the final spring of the 1980s.
The late 1980s in Arlington moved with the steady, practical rhythm of people who lived close enough to the capital to feel its pull, but far enough away to keep their own small lives. Mornings smelled of hot pavement and cheap coffee. Afternoons were folded into fluorescent office light and the hiss of air conditioners, and evenings unspooled with the ordinary tasks that make a neighborhood hum. Laundry steaming on balcony rails, a diner's formica counter sticky with the day's orders, a bus stop where passengers exchanged brief, private glances before stepping back into their routines. The city's power shadow set just across the horizon, invisible in its influence, but obvious in the commute. Suits and uniforms, night shifts and early trains, people arriving and leaving in a daily tide that made faces familiar and names forgettable. Underneath that ordinary surface, a constant low chord ran through everything. The Interstate. It did not roar so much as preside, a braided ribbon of headlights and tailpipes that threaded the county and never truly fell silent. On sleepless nights, it sounded like rain on metal. In the heat of the day, it was the hum beneath conversations, the background bass to arguments behind closed doors, and lullabies in tiny apartments. The highway shaped the town's geometry, where businesses clustered, where the rental units clustered, where broken things could be left and passers-by would not always notice. People moved through these streets carrying the same private bundles anyone carries: unpaid bills, new jobs, hopes for a better tomorrow, fatigue that sometimes frayed into impatience. There were families folding towels in living rooms, teenagers on the edge of young independence, women who worked the late shift and returned home under sodium lights. There were neighbors who nodded but did not ask too many questions, and there were doors that stayed shut except for a few quick exchanges. In the neighborhoods near the troughs of traffic in the back streets, quietness often sat beside tension. Small conflicts that never reached public record, arguments softened by time, separations that were handled in silence. Language braided through the air as easily as the interstate's noise. Spanish spilling softly outside bodegas, English in the offices downtown, the clipped tones of politicians heard on late-night radios. The cultural texture was ordinary and immediate. People found solace in rituals, grocery markets with familiar clerks, a bar that still kept the same stools, a laundromat where stories were shared between cycles. At the edges of that comfort, however, anonymity lurked. The strangers you pass every day who carry unknown histories, the lives that flicker briefly across a porch light before disappearing into shadow. This was a place where routines could mask fracture, where a closed curtain might conceal despair, where the steady pulse of traffic could drown out a cry for help. Within these streets, among these small, ordinary lives, there lived a woman whose story the town would not understand until much later. Now we turn to the life she lived.
Marta Haydee Rodriguez was 26 years old when her life was stolen. To the outside world, she might have seemed like one of countless young women building a future in the shadow of Washington, D.C. But behind the bare facts of her name and age was a human story, one that deserved more than a case file or a faded photograph. She was Hispanic, navigating adulthood in a country that often made survival harder for women like her. At 26, she stood in that fragile place between youthful possibility and the heavy weight of responsibility. She had been married, though the union had fractured, leaving her estranged and living on uncertain terms. That detail alone paints a portrait of vulnerability. Someone rebuilding, someone finding a way forward while carrying the scars of what had come before. Yet so much of Marta's life remains hidden in silence. The records tell us little about her passions, her daily routines, her laughter, or the small joys that defined her. Did she find comfort in music? Did she dream of traveling, of going back to school, of raising a family of her own? The truth is, those answers may never be known. And it is that very absence that deepens the wound, reminding us that Marta was not just a victim. She was a woman whose full story was denied the chance to unfold. What we do know is that she mattered. She had people who cared for her, people who would spend decades haunted by questions and aching for closure. Every year that passed without answers became another year that reduced her to a statistic in the public eye. But for her family, she remained irreplaceable. An empty chair at gatherings, a silence that grew heavier with each passing holiday. Her death was not simply the loss of a young woman. It was the theft of a future, the erasure of dreams, the shattering of bonds that no one could repair. She was 26 years old, and her life was not supposed to end beside an anonymous highway. And yet, that is where Marta's story turns, from the life she lived to the night everything changed. May 26th, 1989. That date became the last entry in the record of Marta Haydee Rodriguez's life. Beyond it, the trail goes cold. What happened on that day has never been fully illuminated, and the silence around her final hours is as unsettling as the crime itself. The documents are sparse, almost frustratingly so. We know only that Marta was reported missing that day. There is no detailed account of her movements, no clear record of who she may have spoken to or where she was last seen. The gaps are enormous, and within those gaps lies the weight of a life abruptly cut off. What we are left with are fragments, scattered details that can only hint at a larger picture. Perhaps a phone rang that evening and went unanswered. Perhaps a light was left burning in a room that should have gone dark. A key resting in a dish by the door. A bag never unpacked. A silence where her presence should have been. These are the images investigators have learned to read like shadows, knowing that in such small traces, the truth often hides. Her family and those who tried to piece together her disappearance believed something went terribly wrong that night. The fact that she was never heard from again speaks louder than any witness statement could. One ordinary day simply became the last, swallowed by the uncertainty of nightfall. And so the timeline stops. May 26, 1989, last known alive, last known present, and then nothing. A young woman vanishes into silence, and the city carries on, unaware that tragedy has just taken hold. But the silence would not last forever, because 2 years later, along the endless hum of I-95, a grim discovery was made.
February 1991. The winter air along Interstate 95 carried the endless hum of traffic, a river of headlights cutting through the night. It was there, just off the shoulder of the highway, that human remains were discovered.
Amid the brush and the dirt, the body of a woman lay hidden in plain sight, steps away from one of the busiest stretches of road in America. Thousands had passed her by, day after day, unaware that she was there. The discovery brought with it a flood of questions, but no answers. Who was she? How had she come to rest in such a place? There were no possessions, no immediate clues, and nothing to give her a name. To investigators, she became Jane Doe, another entry in a growing list of the unidentified, her story suspended in silence. The irony was devastating. Just yards from the roaring traffic of the East Coast's main artery, she was at once so close to the world, and yet completely erased from it. Her remains were collected, examined, and archived, but with no identification and no clear cause or circumstances revealed in the public record, the trail went no further. Her case settled into the cold files, her name stripped away, her face forgotten. For the families of missing women, hope was replaced by gnawing uncertainty. Could she be one of theirs? Or was she someone else, unknown, lost to both memory and record? Years passed. The highway continued to carry its endless stream of lives rushing forward, while her story stayed locked in time.
When the remains were first collected in 1991, investigators did what they could with the tools of the time. The woman was cataloged as an unidentified deceased person, another Jane Doe in a system that already carried too many. Dental records were taken, basic descriptions logged, and her case was entered into the files. But the lead stopped there. Without a name, without someone to connect her to, the investigation had no anchor. The early 90s were not an era of vast, connected databases or rapid forensic breakthroughs. National registries were limited, information rarely traveled far beyond local jurisdictions, and missing persons cases were often siloed, locked away in separate departments. If no one knew to connect the dots stayed apart. Marta's file, though no one then knew it was hers, slowly shifted from active inquiry to the shelves of the cold case unit. Years turned into decades, and her anonymity endured. Families who searched for missing daughters and sisters sometimes looked at her description, wondered if she could be theirs, then walked away with no answers. For investigators, the file stayed open, but open only in the most technical sense. Without the technology we now take for granted, there was little they could do but wait for a break. That break would not come from within her own case, but from somewhere else entirely. Years later, after another homicide and a man's guilty plea, detectives would circle back to the files gathering dust. Suddenly, this Jane Doe, silent for nearly 3 decades, was thrust back into the light. It was then that her identity and the chilling connection it carried began to surface. For nearly 30 years, Marta's family lived in silence and shadow. Every birthday, every holiday, every passing anniversary carried the same gnawing question: where was she? Time moved forward for the world around them, but for those who loved her, it stood painfully still. They had no grave to visit, no certainty to hold on to, only the ache of absence. The community in Arlington, too, felt the weight in quieter ways. Rumors lingered, whispers moved from porch to porch, but without a name, without a face tied to the remains discovered along I-95, there was no way to rally. A Jane Doe cannot draw vigils or candlelight marches. She is a ghost without identity, a wound without acknowledgement. In that silence, grief became private, locked within the walls of a family's home. Every year, the unanswered questions deepened. Had she been lost forever? Had she suffered? Was she still out there, waiting to be found? That kind of waiting is its own torment, a relentless cycle of hope and despair.
For Marta's family, the hardest part was not knowing if they should keep searching or begin mourning. And so the years stretched on, decades defined by uncertainty, until one day, the silence broke and a name finally returned to the woman who had been missing for so long.
Nearly 27 years passed between the discovery of the remains along I-95 and the moment they were finally given a name. From Marta's disappearance in 1989 to her identification in 2018, almost 3 decades slipped away. Decades in which a young woman was reduced to a file marked unidentified. The silence of those years was heavy. Evidence sat in storage, its edges yellowing with time. Witnesses who might have remembered a detail moved away or simply forgot. People who could have answered questions grew older, some passing before the truth emerged. For Marta's family, every year without answers was another year of birthdays missed, another chair left empty, another reminder that grief without closure is its own kind of prison. Cold cases are cruel in their stillness. They demand patience from investigators who refuse to close the book even when progress feels impossible. For some, it is the faint belief that one phone call, one new tool, or one confession will unlock everything. For Marta, that hope flickered quietly for nearly 3 decades, long after most would have assumed her case would never be solved. And then, against all odds, the silence finally cracked, and the story of a Jane Doe took a sharp, devastating turn.
In October of 2017, a breakthrough came from an unexpected place. After years of denying involvement, Jose Rodriguez-Cruz stood in a Washington, D.C. courtroom and admitted what investigators had long suspected. He had beaten and strangled his girlfriend, Pamela Butler, who vanished in 2009. As part of his plea, he led authorities to the site where he had discarded her body, a patch of land since paved over, erasing any chance of recovery. Even without her remains, his words were enough to secure a conviction for second-degree murder. That admission forced detectives to look closer at the man who had hidden in plain sight for so long. If he had killed Pamela, who else could he have silenced? Cold case files were reopened, patterns examined, and one case in particular stood out. The unidentified woman found off I-95 in Virginia back in 1991. In June of 2018, nearly 3 decades after she disappeared, the truth was finally uncovered. Through careful re-examination and the weight of Jose's past admissions, the remains were conclusively identified as those of Marta Haydee Rodriguez. A name restored, a daughter returned, but under the most harrowing of circumstances. Authorities announced that Rodriguez-Cruz was believed responsible for Marta's death as well. Though charges in her case remain pending, the connection was undeniable. 2 women, years apart, both erased by the same man. For Marta's family, it was the answer they had waited nearly 30 years to hear. But with it came the crushing knowledge of what had really happened and the painful reality of justice still unfinished.
Jose Rodriguez-Cruz emerged in the files not as a headline, but as a name that tied 2 vanished lives together. He was the man once married to the woman who disappeared in 1989, and years later, the man who admitted responsibility for a different disappearance in 2009. To investigators, that coincidence demanded scrutiny. To the families, it turned private grief into an urgent search for pattern and motive. The through line the detectives began to trace was not subtle. In the case that produced a guilty plea, he described a violent episode with an intimate partner, and he directed officers to the place where he had left her body, ground that, long after the act, had been altered and buried under pavement. That action revealed a particular brutal calculus, an impulse to hide what had been done, to place the evidence out of reach. When seen beside an earlier unresolved disappearance, the behavior read like a grim signature. Specialists who study intimate partner violence talk about escalation, how abuse can intensify over time, moving from control and intimidation to overt physical harm. When that pattern repeats across relationships, it becomes a map for investigators. In Jose's case, detectives looked for the same contours in separate timelines: a relationship that frayed, a partner who vanished, a vehicle or route that connected the places he frequented. Geography, in this kind of work, matters as much as motive. Highways and commuter corridors offer both opportunity and anonymity. They let a person move without leaving the obvious traces neighbors might notice. Forensic teams and cold case detectives sifted through records with a new lens: phone logs, vehicle registrations, past addresses, any hint of prior complaints. They searched for restraining orders, calls to police that might have been dismissed at the time, and the faint fingerprints of control that often appear in the paperwork of domestic disputes. Where those formal traces were thin or non-existent, investigators relied on pattern, timing, proximity, and method to build the case that one man's conduct had a recurring, deadly outcome. This was not a portrait painted from rumor. It was a methodical assembly of facts, admissions, and correlations. Publicly, prosecutors moved carefully. One conviction for the 2009 death stood on its own, gained through a plea that spared a jury trial. In the earlier matter, officials signaled they believed the same individual bore responsibility and that legal steps were under consideration, though the final chapter in court had not yet closed. Underneath the paperwork and the legal nuance is the human cost. Two women whose lives ended while the world kept turning. Families left to reconcile names with loss. The pattern investigators described was less about headlines and more about behavior that repeated until it could no longer be ignored. Next, the story turns to how the legal system responded.
In June of 2018, nearly 3 decades after she vanished, the woman once known only as a Jane Doe was finally given back her name: Marta Haydee Rodriguez. That single act of identification carried enormous weight. It restored her humanity. It gave her family the certainty they had been denied for so long, and it placed her story within the record of truth instead of the limbo of speculation. By then, Jose Rodriguez-Cruz had already stood in a courtroom, admitting responsibility for the death of another woman, Pamela Butler, in 2009. His guilty plea in October of 2017 laid bare his capacity for violence and deceit, and it forced investigators to reevaluate the past with a sharper eye. In Marta's case, authorities publicly stated they believe he is responsible for her death as well. Charges, they said, were pending. For Marta's loved ones, this was not the kind of closure they had prayed for, but it was something. A name confirmed, a suspect named, and a public acknowledgement that her disappearance had not been forgotten. Relief mingled with grief as they confronted the reality that while the truth had come into focus, full justice remained just out of reach. For the community, too, there was a sense of reckoning. The story of a woman lost in 1989, unidentified in 1991, and recognized only in 2018 was not just a timeline of tragedy. It was a testament to endurance, a reminder that cold cases, no matter how old, still echo in the present. And yet, even with Marta's name spoken again, and the suspect standing in the shadow of another conviction, the final chapter of her case has not been fully written. The weight of justice still lingers ahead.
So many years later, Marta Haydee Rodriguez finally has her name restored, but her story is not complete. The questions that linger are heavy and unrelenting.
What exactly happened the night she disappeared? What were her final moments, and how did they unravel into decades of silence? The man believed to be responsible has already confessed to taking another life, but does his past hold more secrets? Other women, other tragedies left hidden in plain sight? Even now, the full scope of his actions remains uncertain. Were there missed signs, overlooked warnings that might have stopped this long chain of destruction? And most painfully for Marta's family, when will formal justice come for her? Will charges finally be pursued? And will a courtroom one day speak her name with the weight of a verdict, not just an identification? For all the progress made, the truth remains unfinished. A name on a case file restores dignity, but it does not bring back decades of birthdays missed, conversations never had, or the embrace of a daughter, sister, or mother lost. Justice delayed is still justice denied, and until the unanswered questions are resolved, her story stands as both a warning and a plea. The silence around Marta's fate has been broken, but the echoes demand more.
The aftermath of Marta Haydee Rodriguez's case is not measured only in court filings or headlines, but in the slow, fragile work of healing. For her family, the years of silence carved scars that may never fully fade. Each anniversary, each unanswered question left them navigating a grief with no end point. The confirmation of her identity brought a measure of peace, yet it also forced them to relive the pain of losing her all over again. For the community, Marta's story lingers as a quiet warning. She is remembered not just as the woman who vanished, but as a symbol of the countless lives disrupted by domestic violence and silenced by fear. Her case opened conversations about the urgency of protecting those at risk, the importance of believing survivors, and the devastating cost of waiting too long to act. Her name is no longer a case number buried in cold files. It is a reminder of the persistence of investigators who refused to let her disappear into history, of the resilience of a family who never stopped hoping for answers, and of the stark truth that countless others remain missing, unidentified, or unheard. Marta's legacy endures as both a warning and a call. How many other names remain hidden in old records, waiting for recognition? How many families are still waiting for a phone call that might bring answers after decades of silence? For nearly 30 years, she was unknown. Now, she's Marta Haydee Rodriguez. Her name is a reminder. Anonymity can hide tragedy, but persistence can restore a person's place in the story. How many other nameless victims are still waiting to be found?